refusal to do compulsory military service. And she's been involved in the protective presence and solidarity work with Palestinians for over 20 years. We're very interested to hear about her experiences now, but I have asked her to say just a little bit about what it's like to be a refusenik in Israel. Over to you, Sahar.
Thank you, Belinda, and thank you for having me. Yeah, I'll start maybe just by, as Belinda said, kind of speaking a bit about refusal here in Israel, and maybe actually start from today in the sense of saying this is an ongoing movement. So currently there are also quite a lot of refusers in Israel, and we can speak later on exactly what's happening with them these days. But for myself, so I grew up in Jerusalem around the Second Intifada. I was kind of a teenager, so it started becoming politicized into the Second Intifada, during the Second Intifada. And at the time, that also included kind of learning what the realities and the distance of realities between the Jerusalem that I knew in West Jerusalem and a pretty comfortable life to the ones in East Jerusalem, or 20 minutes from my house in different places in the West Bank. That was a completely different reality, right? The building of the fence was happening at the time, and so people being divided, kids my age that I was speaking to being divided, that their village was being divided from the neighboring school, that kind of gap of realities that I think is a very crucial part of understanding what's happening here, because it's not just a gap of reality. If you think about the Second Intifada and people growing up in Israel, Israelis like myself growing up with the kind of what the Second Intifada mean to us, which was suicide bombings and things of the sort, it was very hard for most Israelis to see what did the Second Intifada mean for Palestinians, and the reality of the reoccupation of the Palestinian cities and the amount of people arrested, killed, again, the building of the fence, like all the consequences of what that looked like is something that is always very hard for Israelis to see, but especially in a time like that. And the reason that I'm speaking about that now is that in many ways we're in a different situation today, but that gap is very much a similar situation, a situation where Israelis can live and exist on the one hand in a fair amount of comfort, and obviously not a lot of the last 2 months has been comfort, and there's people who are still waiting for the family members and lost family members and things of the sort. And yet I can sit here right now in a very nice room with electricity connected and a water system and quiet and live a relatively pretty normal life, while that is not true for Palestinians, especially in times like this, also generally always, but especially in times like this. So for me, my politicization was in the middle of one of those moments, right, of those gaps of reality. And starting to see that reality, starting to see that, on the one hand, we're told that, for instance, the building of a fence is for security, that is the goal of it. But then you ask, then why is it dividing between this Palestinian village and the neighboring Palestinian school? What is the security value of something like that? And you start asking those questions, and you start getting a very complicated picture of reality. And once I started joining a lot of the protests that were happening against the building of the fence at the time. And some of it is in villages that, some of you might have visited, like Birain and Yalin, and later on Nabi Salah. And I think one of the things that happened to me, at least as a teenager going into those villages, is that there's this moment where you kind of, you grow up with this idea that soldiers are there to protect you. That's their goal in life. That's what they're raised for. That's what they're there for. And that, to a degree, Palestinians are a threat, right? That's how we're socialized as Israeli Jews, to see Palestinians as threats. And then you go to a protest in a Palestinian village, and you have soldiers shooting at you and Palestinians offering you shelter, and it's kind of, a bit that the whole world doesn't make sense. So going through that as a teenager, the idea of joining the say military that was literally shooting at me the day before, or for that matter, you know, sending the coordinates for the person who will then come and arrest people I know. Like, it doesn't even matter if you're physically there or in a desk, but being part of that system didn't seem like something that was even a possibility for me. So in many ways, I was very lucky, right? Most Israelis, when they arrive to the age of 18, will they join the military or not was never a question. It wasn't something that they asked themselves. It's just the next thing after high school. It's a bit like moving from middle school to high school. You know, it's just the next step. So in a way, I was pretty lucky to be politicized before that and to be able to even ask myself that question. And with that, it was pretty obvious at that point there would not be a question for me. Now, I think it's important to say there's a lot of ways out of military service in Israel. The most common one being mental health. So today, somewhere between about 7% of Israeli citizens, Jewish citizens, don't start military service on the grounds of mental health, and another 7% don't finish it on those grounds. That's actually a huge part of the population. There are other ways to get out of military service. Ultra-Orthodox men don't have to serve, religious women don't have to serve, married women, mothers. So there's quite a lot of categories. And there is theoretically the option of being recognized as a conscientious objector. I say theoretically because it's really just a few dozen people a year who get that status, and it's a military committee that decides on it. And I can tell you, I'm apparently not conscientious enough. I did go through the conscientious objector committee of the military, and I have a nice letter that literally at some point says, like, we do not think. I mean, it's almost in these words, like, we do not find you as a person of conscience and therefore you can serve in the military, which I just find beautiful. And that's kind of the phrasing of what it sounds like. And then I think, again, it's important to say that when people choose not to serve in the military, there's a lot of different ways to do it, also in the sense of, do you want to make a public statement out of it or not? And many people find, you know, back ways out of service. But for me, it was important to take advantage of that moment, in a sense, to talk about the occupation, right? The fact that we are forced into the military, the fact there is conscription, for me is an opportunity to politicize it, because Israelis don't see military service as a political act at all. But they do see refusal as a political act, which is very interesting. Like the refusal to participate in something is political, but participation is not. So for me, it was a really important moment to politicize it, to say, yes, this is what you're joining, to talk about the occupation. And so together with a group of friends, we refused, and we refused publicly. So we wrote a letter, public letter, and kind of went to the media with it. And we were all imprisoned for different periods of time. I spent about 2 months in prison and 3 months in detention. And eventually was released and kind of went back into activism, mostly in Jerusalem. And so that's a bit of kind of my background. But I do want to get to this moment that we're in now. You know, if we'd had this conversation 2 months ago, it would probably sound very different. But I think maybe connecting the background. I think there is someone, yeah, who's unmuted. So.
I'll find it.
So connecting kind of this background to what's happening today, I think is very important, because when we talk about, I mean, refusal is one aspect of militarism, right? Or it's the resistance to a very militarized society. And I think when we try to think about Israeli society, talking about militarism is the core of it. In some ways, I would argue that Zionism as a concept is a militarized solution to anti-Semitism, if you think about the ideology of it, right? It's not, when Zionism poses itself as a response to anti-Semitism and says the Jewish people need a homeland, they need a state. Actually, what people are saying, not necessarily those words, but the kind of underlying message around it is for the Jews to have an army, to have a military, right? To have the ability to physically protect themselves. That's kind of the Zionist narrative. Now, we can go into deconstructing it, and I'm sure you have in a lot of conversations, but narrative-wise, that is what it is. And I think it's important to say, first of all, for thousands of years, there have been a lot of different forms in which Jewish communities dealt with anti-Semitism, or with anti-Jewishness. Anti-Semitism is kind of a very new concept, relatively. But militarism was a very small part of that history. And some of it has been assimilation, some of it has been the exact opposite, is being in remote communities. So, I mean, there's been a lot of different attempts throughout the years, but the militaristic solution, the solution that says, if there is anti-Semitism, what we do with it is take up a gun and fight, is relatively a very new one. And that's what kind of Zionism brought into the world. It's a very new one, but today it's almost the completely dominant one, right? It's the only one we hear about. And including in times like this, right? And again, what we'll get to speaking about today, but if you think even about what Jewish communities around the world, how they're responding to the political situation today, which I have no doubt also includes increase in anti-Semitism around the world, as well as an increase in a lot of things that I probably wouldn't say are anti-Semitic and are actual criticism of Israel. But even just saying yes, there's probably a rise in anti-Semitism around this. The response of many Jewish communities today in the world is about security guards around synagogues and is about arming a community. In many ways, that's a response that Zionism imposed. And it's a response that affects Jewish communities outside of Israel, but obviously is what the state here is kind of founded on. And I think it's important to state that right now, mostly because I think that there's a lot to say about what happened on October 7th and everything that followed. But I think the main takeaway I would have liked Israeli society to take out of it, and it's definitely not what's happening, but the main one I would have liked to see is looking at October 7th and saying how much that idea that militarism can be a solution, that you can find a way with enough soldiers, with enough technology, with a strong enough military to prevent harm, how much that paradigm collapsed. And it's sad for me that as a society, we're not having that conversation. But theoretically, and as a person who, like, my whole life has been around countering militarization, for me, that was just such a clear, not example, just a clear, a show of how much militaristic paradigms have a limit, a very clear limit. And you can have the strongest military and fight against some like forces that are clearly not close to the same military level and lose in the sense of people dying. So that's just one aspect of what's happening today that I want to talk about, which is this militaristic mindset. And the sad thing about it is that the solution that Israeli society is now giving to it is just more of the same, right? And we're seeing that obviously in Gaza, and we're seeing that with over 20,000 people killed. But it's just this idea that if we keep doing the same mistake over and over again, somehow it will have a different solution. So that's part of what's happening today. And I won't speak much about Gaza because I'm not the right person to speak about Gaza. As I said, I'm sitting in a very comfortable room when, we literally hear the airplanes above our heads all day long going to bomb Gaza. And texting friends in Gaza, kind of, it's texting them to check in that they're still alive, right? You have nothing to say. You're just kind of like, please text me back. So I won't speak about that reality because I can't understand it, can't begin to imagine it. But what I can speak about is a bit about what's happening here right now in the last 2 months within Israel. And I'll start by just saying that the shrinking of civic space within Israel, and obviously Palestinian citizens of Israel are the ones who are suffering the most from that shrinking of space. And we've seen that in people being suspended from schools, from universities. We've seen that in people getting fired, especially in the education system. So teachers getting fired or suspended. And we've seen that with Palestinians getting arrested for Facebook posts and social media posts. And we're seeing a lot of it not just coming from institutions, but from civil society, in the sense of especially on social media, attacks on, again, mostly Palestinians, but also Israeli Jews who dare to say anything critical of the state, or even just show solidarity with Gazans, that are having huge social media campaigns against them. We've had kind of Telegram groups that are specifically intended for doxing, for publicizing private addresses of people and trying to get people to harm them. So far, we've only had one physical attack on someone that was organized in that way, but the assumption is that more will follow. And so really there's an atmosphere, especially for Palestinian citizens of Israel, but definitely also for Jewish ones. I mean, there was a teacher, a Jewish Israeli teacher, who was writing posts around Gazans dying, and kind of every time, there's personal stories of Gazans who were killed, and spent about 4 days in jail before eventually being released, and the likelihood of being indicted is very low, but that's the reality today. Every time we tried to protest, not even protesting the war on Gaza. I mean, we started protest, like at some point we were protesting the fact that people were not allowed to protest the war on Gaza, and got beat up, clubs, police officers. I mean, the level of violence, and it's not that Israeli actors are not used to violence and police brutality, it's just that the level was a whole other scale. So there's that shrinking of civic space in Israel, that is coming together with the fact that most of Israeli society is really just kind of like rounding up, support our troops kind of thing, including the part of Israeli society that's a bit critical of the policies of the government, right? There's a huge part of Israeli society that's very anti-government right now, very anti-Netanyahu, and blame him for a lot of what happened as far as responsibility goes, that think that his policies right now are terrible, and that the fact that there isn't another deal for releasing the rest of the hostages is a huge mistake. There is a demand for that. There are protests. But even in those protests that are very much criticizing where the government is at, you still hear this clear, like, we support our troops, and that kind of militaristic mindset is throughout, including in the kind of more critical circles. So that's a bit about the kind of threats that are towards those who dare to resist what's currently happening. But while we speak a lot, and I'll say, like, the activist community that I'm part of, traditionally in situations like this, not that we've been exactly in a situation like this, but in previous attacks in Gaza, we're used to going out to the streets and demanding a ceasefire and demanding the end to killing in Gaza and so on. And this is the first time I remember that we find ourselves not knowing what to do. And it's not knowing what to do, first of all, because the price of protesting has gone dramatically up, right? We know that we won't survive more than a few minutes in a protest. But secondly, because it feels like we're used to being a minority, but it really feels like, who's going to listen now? And what's the point of protesting if you have zero audience? We never think we'll convince the masses, but you think you'll speak to someone. Otherwise, what's the point? And I feel like now we're in a space where we're not sure what's the point even. So I think what we've seen, and it's not that there aren't attempts, and it is important for me to say, so yesterday we were in a protest in Tel Aviv of about 200 people, that was speaking specifically about Gaza, and calling for a ceasefire. So it's not that it doesn't exist at all, but it's a much smaller space than what we would be used to. I think that one of the interesting things that happens is that a lot of the people looking for what to do, what is possible to do right now, are looking towards the West Bank. Because in the West Bank, over the last 2 months, over just the first month, actually, after October 7th, 14 Palestinian communities were displaced by settler violence, specifically, settler threats and violence. And that's communities in Area C, and I know that there's a few people who've been ecumenic accompaniers here, so I'm sure you know these communities very well. And with very little international presence in these places, obviously, most from programs, including the EAs, were evacuated after October 7th, of course. The need for Israeli protective presence, Israeli activists coming in, was increased dramatically. And it's not that we didn't used to do this work before, we have been for years, but we've really come to a point where, you know, at any given moment, there's between 4 to 8 Palestinian villages that have protective presence, Israeli protective presence in them every night. And that's been true for the last, let's say, month and a half, maybe not the first week or two, but ever since then, which is, you know, pretty unprecedented numbers. So it is important for me to say that, like, it's not that the Israeli radical left doesn't find a place at all for itself, and is doing extremely important work, but that the space is very much shifting. And I think we're still trying to understand what our role is in this shifting space, and where are places where we can be useful and where we can't. And this search, it is important to say, is done in a very difficult emotional space. And I think, I mean, we can talk about this more in questions and answers, and I always prefer to know where you want to take the conversation than just speaking at you. But I think that, I mean, with all the criticism, we are part of Israeli society. I am an Israeli. That is, you know, still the people around me, the culture around me, the media that I consume, even if I'm extremely critical of it, the stories that I hear, the people that I know, which means that unlike previous attacks on Gaza, the personal connection to people who were affected on October 7th is far stronger. And specifically, there's a quite a statistical imbalance with who was affected mostly on October 7th. And it's actually disproportionately the peace community, which has to do with the demographics of the kibbutzim around Gaza. I mean, we can talk about why that happened, but that is the bottom line of it. Which means that we all know people who've been affected in different ways. So there is also an emotional aspect of trying to think, like, mourn within your community, but also mourn what your community is doing in response at the same time, and holding both those griefs at the same time. And it's something that, you know, beyond the practical questions of what we can do as a community, there is also the emotional questions of what we're capable right now as a community. And I don't think I have answers to that, but I just want to also name that and kind of put it on the table as part of this conversation as well, which is just, you know, part of being an activist is holding pain. And part of being an activist in the last 2 months is holding a lot of different kinds of pain at the same time. So maybe I'll pause with that, and we'll do this more kind of questions and see where you want to take this conversation.
Okay, thanks very much, Sahar, and we'll stop the recording there. I think, John, you can do that, can you? Anyway, I think we've stopped the recording. I'd invite people to